Every painting by Picasso is an amazing puzzle, and today we will learn how to solve them together. Picasso started drawing from an early childhood under the guidance of his father, José Ruiz Blasco, who was an art teacher. His father discovered great talent in him, and at the age of 8, Picasso painted his first oil portrait, the Picador, after watching a horse bullfight which made a huge impression on him. Later on, we will see many more bullfight scenes in his works. He would carry this portrait with him all his life as a starting point of his art. When Picasso was 10, his family moved to Barcelona, where he entered the La Lonja School of Fine Arts. He was only 14 years old. At that age, students were not usually admitted, but his father, who got a job there, managed to get him accepted. He passed the entrance competition with honor and was accepted. And from this moment on, we will immerse ourselves in a fascinating observation of the events in Picasso's life that transformed his outlook on life and simultaneously changed his art. Event 1. The Shadows of El Greco. At age 16, Picasso briefly enrolls in Madrid's Royal Academy of Fine Arts of San Fernando for a year. But he doesn't like classicism and the conservative teaching methods. He skips lectures and spends most of his time at the Prado Museum, seeing El Greco paintings for the first time. El Greco is a genius with a completely unique style, a true revolutionary of the 17th century. He managed, even within the very constrained, dogmatic religious art of that time, to create his own unique style. And this fascinates the young Picasso. The dark colors, deep shadows, elongated, almost fluid, twisted limbs, all of this enchants the future artist. Remember this moment. El Greco's works will soon be reflected in Picasso's early experiments, in his first steps toward his own unique style. Almost all great artists imitated someone at the beginning of their journey. The search for oneself is natural for an artist and usually begins with copying the most impressive experiences of predecessors until he finds his own style. Event 2. Suicide. In 1900, Picasso went to Paris with his friend Carlos Casagemas for the World's Fair, where he became acquainted with the works of the Impressionists. He is 19 years old, he has no money, and even this trip is paid for by Casagemas. But his poverty is compensated by his immense curiosity and incredible ambition, perhaps one of the greatest in the history of art. At this time, Fauvism, Pointillism, Post-Impressionism, and many other isms emerge. And for every artist, it becomes the goal of their life and career to become the founder of their own movement in painting, their own ism. Be sure to watch my video about the Impressionists to understand what those times were like. The link will be in the description. Picasso short on funds, finds Paris quite costly to live in, making it less than idyllic. Together with Casagemas, they settled in a tiny room in Montmartre. Back then, Montmartre was a haven for bohemians, meaning it was a kind of art crowd mixed with fences and prostitutes. The room they lived in was so small that they had to work in turns, Carlos during the day and Picasso at night. And while Picasso was getting used to the new city and the life of an artist in Montmartre, Carlos Casagemas fell in love with a French dancer from the Moulin Rouge Cabaret, Germaine Pichot. This love was unrequited, and Casagemas began to drink and fell into depression. And in 1901, an event occurred that became the first shock in Picasso's life and would become an important turning point in his work. Casagemas, after being rejected once again by Germaine to marry him, tried to shoot her in one of the Parisian cafes and after missing, shot himself in the head. Casagemas died suddenly, never knowing that Pichot survived. This incident shocked Picasso. He withdrew into himself, and 5 months later, the first painting of his famous Blue Period evocation, The Burial of Casagemas, was created. This period is known as blue by critics, though Picasso himself didn't see it that way. However, life in Montmartre, in poverty and surrounded by poor people struggling to survive, was reflected in his paintings. The shock of losing a friend at such a young age further deepened the colors of despair and drama that he witnessed around him every day. Perhaps it was not only the personal loss of a friend, but also the loss of a companion with whom they shared a room and expenses. It was twice as hard for Picasso to live in Paris alone. Picasso really disliked this period of his life and got rid of everything that reminded him of his miserable existence. And Picasso leaves Paris and goes back to Spain. He returned to Paris in May 1901, rented the same studio that he and Casagemas had shared, and visited the cafe where Carlos had committed suicide. True to his character, Picasso ultimately began an affair with Germaine. One of them remained a part of his life for many years and was one of the models who posed for him for Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. It should be said that the early 1900s were a time when the Impressionists were finally beginning to be accepted. This was perhaps the most interesting and turbulent time in the history of art. Finally, the Paris Academy of Arts' grip loosened, initiating an era of artistic exploration. In this period, we can clearly see the influence of El Greco, whose paintings Picasso studied in Madrid. Look at those same swirling lines, distorted hands, deep dramatic shadows, and the overall sense of gloom, sadness, and even hopelessness. The blue period, with its blue-green tones, conveys sadness and loneliness in Picasso's paintings, while showing early Impressionist influences. These are simplified, almost flat figures with unnatural colors. The blue period will last until 1904, when it will be replaced by the rose period. Event 3, First Love. In 1904, Picasso meets the model Fernanda Olivier, who had run away from her husband and was living near Picasso's studio. Their 7-year relationship will be filled with constant turmoil. Both Olivier and Picasso were jealous lovers, and their passions sometimes even led to fights involving Picasso. Now, at 24, he experiences love for the first time, having overcome the shock of his friend's passing. Everything seems rosy to the young man, and this is immediately reflected in his work. Fernanda was a passionate admirer of the circus, and Picasso quickly became involved in circus life. He is captivated by the contrast between the brightness and cheerfulness of the circus setting and the poverty of the performers' lives, which fill his paintings. The well-known Girl on a Ball, which is in the collection of the Pushkin Museum, is considered a transitional painting from the blue period to the rose period. During this period, which would last only a couple of years, it is as if life and emotions are added to Picasso's canvases, which undoubtedly became a projection of his new feelings never experienced before. Fernanda Olivier would become his muse and model for 80 paintings, including the first Cubist works, Event 4, and the portrait of Gertrude Stein. We are already almost approaching Cubism. Do you remember in one of the videos I told you about Malevich's Black Square? In the same way, it's very important for us to follow in Picasso's footsteps, step by step, to understand how this brilliant idea came to his mind. In 1905, a year after meeting Fernanda, Picasso meets Gertrude Stein in Paris, an American writer and literary theorist. Paris was a hub for celebrities from around the globe at that time. The city's free-thinking atmosphere and expanding horizons drew artists to the French capital. And those who now seem like gods to us were young and inexperienced at that time, easily gathering in cafes, talking, arguing, competing, falling in love, getting drunk, and enriching each other with ideas and the scent of real alcohol on their breath. Impressed by the personality of the American writer, Picasso offered to paint her portrait and started working on it in the fall, 1905. According to Stein, there were about 90 posing sessions in total, which took place in the artist's studio. But in the spring of 1906, after many attempts to paint Gertrude's face, he said that he no longer saw her when he looked at her. His artistic eye was blinded. He erased her face. He went to Spain to his parents and returned to the painting only at the end of 1906 and quickly finished the portrait from memory. Remember these dates and this break, we will really need them. Because in the end, he created a proto-cubist portrait that was completely unlike anything before. Look, there's no symmetry in it anymore. We see in this almost fractured face the first signs of Cubism, which will soon appear in the Avignon Maiden. Pay attention to the eyes. For the first time here, we see an unpainted black iris. The portrait looks stern, even brutal. In this portrait, Gertrude is only 32 years old, but she looks older. The portrait sparked a lot of discussion in artistic circles. Some saw it as a new word in painting, but most noted that the portrait did not resemble its subject at all. Everyone thinks that she doesn't look like her own portrait at all, but that's okay. In the end, she will manage to look exactly like that, said Picasso in response to the criticism. But Gertrude really liked the portrait, and at the end of her life, she would call it the only true depiction of herself. This change in style became a turning point in Picasso's work. We're turning onto the home stretch, which is about to lead us to Cubism. But how did Picasso come to the idea of the famous style that literally turned the art world upside down? Event 5. Matisse's African Statuette. In search of inspiration, many artists of that time turned to other cultures, East Asian, African. And for us, one memory of the young Cubist artist Max Jacob is important, written later in 1911. He describes a meeting of artists that took place right in the middle of 1906, the year the portrait of Gertrude Stein was painted, which Gaev attended. Apollinaire, Matisse, Picasso, and Max himself. Jaco Apollinaire was just as surprised as I was by his birth. Cubism was born one morning, or rather one evening. Apollinaire, Picasso, and I had dinner at Matisse's, who showed us an African statuette that Picasso studied intently. And the next day, when I arrived at 13 Ravignan Street, I found large sheets of paper on the floor, covered with black lines. From that day on, Picasso immersed himself in meditation and silence. It seems this was in 1906. Do you remember that very break in painting Gertrude Stein's portrait? I would argue that the dinner being described took place precisely during that break. And it was this statuette that inspired Picasso to his first experiment, and Picasso enthusiastically returned to the portrait, already having in mind what he wanted to depict on it. The first step toward a new word in art? Thus we see that a completely random event, seeing the African statuette as a revelation, was imprinted in the artist's mind and gave birth to something new. I want to emphasize again that to understand art, it's not enough to just look at paintings. You need to understand how and why the artist created them. But the most interesting part is yet to come. Impressed, Picasso, together with Guillaume Apollinaire and Andrea Derain, immediately went to the Trocadero Ethnological Museum, where colonial trophies were on display. By that time, Derain was already a fan of African art, which he had discovered at the British Museum. Visiting that exhibition inspired Picasso even more and made him not only admire the works of African natives, but eventually start collecting them. Collecting African figurines would soon nearly land Picasso in jail, but wait a moment. Picasso recalls, "The smell of mold and disgust gripped my throat. I was so depressed that at first I was about to leave immediately, but I forced myself to stay. To study these masks, all these objects that people created with the sacred purpose of serving as intermediaries between themselves and the unknown hostile forces surrounding them. People tried to overcome their fears by giving them color and shape, and I realized what painting truly means. It's not an aesthetic process, it's a form of magic that stands between us and a hostile universe. It embodies both our fears and our desires." That day, I realized that I had found my path. In later years, Picasso would try to soften and hide the connection between the emergence of Cubism and African statuettes. That made the origin of the idea seem too simple, dispelling the magic and aura of genius. Here's how vaguely he would describe that same period. "Later, my most powerful artistic experiences came when I suddenly discovered the amazing beauty of sculptures created by the anonymous artists of Africa. These works of religious, passionate, and strictly logical art are among the most impressive and beautiful creations of human imagination." Just like Malevich, who later came up with the black lightning bolt that supposedly inspired his idea for the black square. Yes, probably like any vain artist, Picasso tries to embellish the moment of his greatest revelation in life. And who wouldn't want that? He doesn't want to attribute the idea to some ordinary African figurine. He wants to create a myth of divine insight that had been dormant inside Picasso himself, and only inside him. But we, as usual, won't fall for this trick, because, in my opinion, there's nothing wrong with the fact that even the most incredible things in the world of art are the result of rather simple things happening to the right person at the right time. After all, thousands of people and artists saw these statuettes before Picasso, but only he, or at least he was the first, was inspired by them to do something that would break art and shatter it into cubes. Event 6, Bardelli. In July 2007, Newsweek published a 2-page article identifying the next painting I'm going to tell you about as the most influential work of art of the past 100 years. In June 2017, the New York Times published an article by art critic Holland Cotter claiming that Picasso changed the history of this work. He replaced the harmless ideal of the classical nude body with a new kind of aggressively sexual and dangerous beings. It seems that the world has never seen an artist as amorous as Picasso. His sexual life started when he was 14, while studying at Barcelona's School of Fine Arts. His teacher, Marcel, took the young Picasso to a brothel at his request, where for 5 pesetas the future great artist experienced the joys of sex for the first time. After moving to Paris and mingling with the artistic crowd, Picasso did not deny himself the company of singers and dancers, the Moulin Rouge as we already know. And when he returned to his native Barcelona, he often visited the red light district. In his early years before meeting Fernanda Olivier, Picasso frequently visited brothels. His connection with them was far from fleeting. It can be said that during his formative years, this connection defined his sexual life, even though it's not something people usually talk about. And it seems quite natural to me that at the time when Picasso developed a new aesthetic approach in painting, the first painting that clearly marks the beginning of Cubism would be a painting about a brothel. Picasso begins preparing to paint the most important painting of his life. It will take him a whole 9 months to do this. Never in his life had Picasso devoted so much time to a single painting. It will undergo endless transformations, eventually crystallizing in Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. Picasso made hundreds of sketches of the demoiselle. It is these that will show us the direction of the artist's thought from beginning to end. In his sketches, we see 3 important turning points. Now we will look at them separately. Initially, Picasso had a rather banal plot in mind. A student enters a brothel and 5 girls offer themselves to him. In the first version, there were even 2 male figures, but soon they will disappear one by one. The story of Picasso and his past in brothels will be useful to us here. He was more familiar with this mise en scène than anyone else. Notice that in the first version, all the girls are looking at the person who entered. It's quite a banal plot, one that Picasso had taken part in many times in his life. Then look, the student turned into one of the ladies, and the 6th figure was removed from the composition. And it would be strange to leave the rest of the girls staring at their friend. Picasso decides to turn their gazes toward the viewer, and this turns out to be a very powerful decision. There is a sense of challenge in this, a display of their own nudity, but the interaction with the viewer is now direct, without any intermediaries. Perhaps this technique was suggested to him by Manet's Olympia, which once caused quite a stir precisely because of its bold gaze at the viewer. Picasso also invites us to look at the beauties not furtively, but directly, as they themselves look at you shamelessly, displaying themselves. Let's admit it, we're all ready to look at the beautiful body on the beach, but we'll immediately turn away if its owner looks at us. And a direct gaze at the viewer is a kind of challenge, boldness, I would even say, indecency. Notice that here we still see the roundness of the forms and there is no hint of cubism. And finally, perhaps the most important change. Finally, the faces of the 2 figures on the right acquire the characteristic features of African masks, and the whole composition becomes angular. It is this change that will become prophetic for Picasso and for all of art. This coincides with Picasso's introduction to the masks at the museum. It seems most likely to me that Picasso, already feeling that he has discovered something new, is feverishly searching for the final version at this time. He doesn't dare to put masks on all 5, but he distorts and simplifies the bodies of the others, following his intuition. And it's very interesting to watch how he searches, how he struggles, how he changes the idea for the 100th time until he finds something that seems like a huge risk and at the same time will become a huge breakthrough. Event 7, Meeting with George Sprague. The Avignon Maidens do not yet represent the Cubist period, but rather the intermediate Black or African period, the forerunner of Cubism. Notice that this is already the 4th period in Picasso's search. The artist evolves, develops, reflects, and is constantly searching for his unique style, with each painting coming closer to a discovery. That's usually how it happens. It's not a sudden insight or a bolt of lightning, but persistent work, inspiration from the works of great masters, and rethinking the art of other cultures that lead to great discoveries. Very soon, we'll have the key to Picasso's works in our hands. The period will last only 2 years, until 1909. At 27 years old, Picasso is already considered a mature man by early 20th century standards. Typically, men at this age already have a family with a few kids. Picasso remains unmarried, continuing to reside with Fernanda Olivier despite their deteriorating relationship. At the same time, Picasso becomes closer with the French artist Georges Braque. In 1907, Braque comes to Picasso's studio. to visit the sensational Avignon brothel and appreciate the novelty of Picasso's captivating approach. Braque moves away from imitating Matisse and fully immerses himself in Picasso's aesthetic, but not as an imitator, rather as a partner. They have a lot in common. They are the same age, not just close in age. Braque is 25, Picasso is 26, Picasso is 26. They are both searching and both are art rebels. By that time, Braque was a participant in the rebellious art movement Wild Beasts and a follower of Fauvism. And of course, both are very talented and ambitious. In this duo, Cubism would soon crystallize. They help each other, criticize, discuss ideas and paintings. They become comrades, students, critics, and mentors to each other. If you've ever worked on a project together with someone, you know the kind of drive it gives you when a like-minded person next to you is bursting with ideas. Two heads are better than one, right? Their collaboration and rivalry simultaneously accelerate their creative thinking pace. Their connection was so close that sometimes even they themselves had difficulty determining the exact authorship of the paintings. Picasso later recalled, "Almost every evening, either I would come to Braque's studio or he would come to mine. Each of us had to see what the other had done during the day." Braque once put it more poetically, "We were like two mountaineers roped together." And the peak they were climbing, of course, was Cubism. And I'm not emphasizing this partnership for nothing. Soon you will learn some aspects of the emergence of Cubism that are unknown to the general public. Perhaps the relationship between Braque and Picasso was best described by William Rubin, the former director of the Department of Painting and Sculpture at the MoMA Museum in New York. The Braque-Picasso collaboration is unparalleled in art history for its duration, intensity, and impact. No other modern style was the simultaneous invention of two artists in dialogue with each other. During their years of collaboration, Picasso and Braque created not only a number of great works, but also a visual language. The Cubism we know was a vision that no single artist could have achieved alone. Event 8, the death of Cézanne. Now, let's go back a few years. It is generally believed that Picasso is the founder of Cubism, but there are some inconsistencies in the chronology of Picasso's work and the emergence of Cubism that piqued my curiosity and cast doubt on this idea. You'll see everything for yourself now. In 1906, Paul Cézanne passed away, and in 1907 a posthumous exhibition of his works was held. It included works from his final period. According to many contemporaries, this exhibition marks the end of Impressionism and the transition to a new stage in painting. At the exhibition, Cézanne's work Mont Sainte-Victoire is displayed, which he created back in 1817 years before the exhibition. Simultaneously, his postulates are published, describing the breakdown of complex object forms into simple geometric shapes. Cézanne simplifies nature into three shapes: cylinders, spheres, and cones. These postulates, which introduce a new way of thinking in painting, make a huge impression on many young artists. In the autumn of the following year, 1908, Georges Braque takes part in the Autumn Salon, where he presents 6 landscapes painted in a new manner for him, which emerged under the influence of Cézanne. Here is one of them. The jury of the Salon, which included Matisse, who was already famous by that time, rejects his works. Matisse remarks, "Braque has submitted a painting made entirely of little cubes. It was this statement by Matisse that spread by word of mouth and became the root of the name Cubism, in response to Matisse's negative criticism. The gallerist Kahnweiler organizes an exhibition of Georges Braque's new works in his gallery. Take a close look. This exhibition becomes the first display of Cubist paintings. At this time, Picasso is fascinated by African art, and this period of his work is called the African period. Notice that it was Braque, following the ideas of Cézanne, who painted the first series of Cubist paintings. Compare the paintings of Braque and Picasso from the same period. On the left is Picasso. Jugs, bowls in the center is classic Cubism, and on the right is a painting by Braque. Agree, if we were to choose blindly, we would be much more likely to attribute Cubism to Braque. But look what happens next. In 1909, Picasso visits Spain, his homeland, and paints outdoors extensively. Back in Paris, he surprises everyone by organizing an exhibition. His landscapes show clear signs of the painting style that we have already seen in Cézanne and Braque. Picasso exclaims to nature, "You must see the cylinder, the sphere, the cone," almost word for word the postulates of Cézanne. I'm not trying to diminish Picasso's achievements in any way. Later he himself, like a locomotive, will push and develop Cubism to unimaginable heights. But if you reconstruct the events, it becomes clear that the idea, or if you prefer, the theory of Cubism was invented by Cézanne, and the first Cubist paintings were created by Braque. Picasso pioneered Cubism, which involved breaking down space into its constituent parts, only in 1909, a year later than Braque. However, later on, his African period would also unexpectedly be called Cubism. And voila, the beginning of Cubism is set in 1907 with Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, a year before Braque. As for me, yes. Picasso's African period is just as important as a step in his development and in the development of art, but if we believe the facts, Picasso was neither the ideologist nor the first Cubist artist. I would say that he became its spokesman, energetic, even fierce and desperately ambitious. Perhaps without Picasso's energy, the breakthrough that we enjoy today would not have happened. We have seen many times that it's not just the idea itself, but the persistent effort to popularize it that makes success truly successful. Braque and Picasso continued collaborating and competing for several years. But in 1912, World War I would begin, and in 1914, Braque was drafted into the French army. Picasso was not drafted because he was Spanish. Soon, Braque was wounded in the head, he became seriously ill, and after his recovery, he never returned to Cubism, leaving Picasso to take full control of their shared legacy. And here, Picasso's talent for developing ideas finds the most fertile ground. The artist always dares to go further and bolder than anyone else. If Braque tried to preserve harmony, recognizability, and familiar features in his works, Picasso did the exact opposite. He posed precisely the kind of challenge to the viewer that would become the manifesto of new art. It's not necessary to depict an object as recognizable. Art can work not only with the form of an object, but also with reality itself. Picasso essentially begins the most important and longest game of his life. To paint an object as far from its real-life appearance as possible, but still make it so that the viewer recognizes it. That's why, at first, his paintings feature a lot of objects with elements that are 100% recognizable. A violin, its holes, a guitar, strings, a human face, a nose, eyes. This period of Picasso's work is called analytical cubism, meaning an attempt to break down reality so that the object stops being itself and falls apart into pieces as if we're looking at it from different points of view at the same time. And Pablo Picasso will handle this exciting new challenge brilliantly. Event 9, the theft of the Mona Lisa. We're now chronologically nearing the incident I promised to share with you. Although it didn't influence his work, it will help us understand what kind of person Pablo Picasso was, or rather, that he was just a human being. So in 1911, the Mona Lisa was stolen from the Louvre. If you don't know this fascinating story, watch my video about the theft. It's a real detective story. The link will be in the description. As I already told you, Picasso was a fan of Iberian sculptures, and his close friend Apollinaire, knowing Picasso's passion, persuaded his friend Géry Pierre to steal 2 statuettes from the Louvre. At that time, the Louvre had little security and no alarm system. Technically, stealing the statuettes and sneaking them out under a loose coat was not difficult at all. Picasso bought the statuettes for only 100 francs, which is $440 in our money. He didn't hide them, and even boasted about them to his artist friends. It was a very valuable trophy stolen from the Louvre, the ancestors of Cubism. But easy money tempted Perrier, who was short on funds, and just a couple of days before the theft of the Mona Lisa, he stole 2 more figurines and offered them to Apollinaire. But the news of the painting's theft was already making global headlines. Apollinaire, terrified, rejected Perrier's generous offer and pushed him out to avoid trouble. Yet the wheel had started turning. Police conclude the Mona Lisa and figurine thefts were committed by the same individual. And on Picasso's mantelpiece, there's a figurine from the Louvre, and everyone knows about it. Picasso's thirst for fame played a bad trick on him this time, and the artist starts to go mad with fear. He sees policemen everywhere watching him, and he and Apollinaire plan to flee France. Fernando Olivier describes it like this: they were like repentant children, gripped by fear and making plans to escape the country. They wanted to immediately get rid of the compromising items and eventually decided to throw the suitcase with the figurines into the Seine at night. They left the house around midnight with the suitcases in their hands and returned at 2 in the morning, completely exhausted, having done nothing with the suitcases or their contents. They wandered back and forth, unable to get rid of the items, thinking they were being watched. Their imagination came up with thousands of possible scenarios, each one more absurd than the last. The buyers of stolen goods are eventually arrested in the end. Both cry and plead for forgiveness, and 4 days later, they face the court. In front of the judge, Picasso makes a desperate and unexpected move for his friend. He declares that he doesn't know Apollinaire at all, and that the whole thing is his doing. Decades later, Picasso spoke about this statement in an interview. When the judge asked me, "Do you know this gentleman?" I replied, "I have never seen this man before." I noticed how Guillaume's expression changed. The blood drained from his face. I'm still ashamed of that. Both men were literally sobbing, begging the court for forgiveness. The judge ultimately decided that this miserable pair was unlikely to be involved in the Mona Lisa heist. Both criminals were forgiven and released. As you can see, Picasso could even betray a friend to save his own skin. That's why we will repeat it again and again. Artists are just people, with all the weaknesses that we have as well. And that's exactly what makes their work so emotional and close to us, because the emotions embedded in them are familiar to us as well. Event 10. Meeting with Ola Koklova. From 1917 to 1925. Picasso becomes interested in Russian ballet. In 1917, he works on the set designs for the ballet parade and meets Olha Koklova, a Russian ballerina. He falls deeply in love with her and for the first time decides to marry. Ola and Pablo were married on June 18, 1918 in Paris at the Alexander Nevsky Orthodox Cathedral. Jean Cocteau and Max Jacob were witnesses at the wedding. After getting married, at her husband's insistence, Olha ended her ballet career and they would live happily together until 1927 when Picasso started pursuing a new woman. By the early 1920s, he had completely exhausted and moved away from Cubism, and soon the Surrealists, led by Salvador Dali appeared on the scene. Dali met Picasso in 1926. At that time, Picasso, 35, was already wealthy and famous, while Dali, only 22, looked up to him as a younger man admires an elder. But as we know, this won't last long. Dali will soon become even more of a provocateur and fame seeker than Picasso, with whom he will remain in a lifelong friendly rivalry for the title of the coolest Spaniard. Surrealism inspires Picasso as well, and by the end of the 1920s begins perhaps the most complex and uneven, but my favorite period. Picasso? This, in my opinion, is the last truly impressive period, full of searching and turmoil. I'm sure you are very familiar with the paintings from this period, and generally, they are the most incomprehensible in his work. And now we will learn how to read them based on what we already know about Picasso. During this time, Picasso appears to synthesize all his developments from years of work. Let's analyze a few paintings from this period that you may have already seen, and that most likely seemed like a mess to you. Look at this painting from 1929. Just try to guess what is depicted in it. You have to admit it's pretty difficult, but if I tell you the title of the painting, everything will fall into place. The title of the painting is The Kiss, and right away, we see a kiss. Here are two heads, eyes and lips. What is Picasso doing? Picasso is trying to simplify the form of a very familiar gesture as much as possible. He makes it so abstract that people aren't immediately recognizable here. Picasso is exploring the boundaries of how objects can be recognized. How much can you simplify an image so that a kiss is still recognizable? And here is another kiss from the same year. This shows the same experiment with a different approach. We will also see in each eye a hint of hair, teeth, and noses. Though the kiss is barely visible, we can easily make out two heads facing one another. Let's deprive them of the typical anthropomorphic features like eyes and teeth, and the kiss will become completely unreadable. Remove any of the elements and the scene will become too abstract. And Picasso tries to balance and leave us with an emotion that simple abstract figures cannot provide. And what could be more emotional than a kiss? And we move on to the year 1930. Picasso begins not only to minimize the number of elements, but also to distort proportions and swap familiar facial features. Look, if it weren't for the two eyes, would you guess that this is a head? Let me remove them for you now. This drawing clearly shows the direction of Picasso's experiment, which will develop further. How much can you mix up the human face so that we still see a head or even an emotion in it? 1931, and once again a kiss. Look here. We can already see the clear influence of Surrealism, but in Picasso's unique and very recognizable manner. While the Surrealists focused on the bizarre, the fantastic, or even the grotesque in their mise-en-scène, Picasso once again experiments with the human body. Here, it's almost impossible to tell which parts belong to whom, and that's done intentionally. But we see two breasts, two heads, tongues, and we understand that there are two people and one of them is clearly a woman. And perhaps in one of the parts, something is hidden that makes the second figure a man. Let me do an experiment for you again and remove the most recognizable body parts. As if by magic, all the narrative and mystery vanished from the painting, leaving just a pile of boulders. Amazing, isn't it? Just as Surrealism depicts impossible scenes, Picasso depicts impossible bodies. But while Surrealists simply show us a strange world, Picasso also plays with the viewer, making him tilt his head and guess what he's seeing. Isn't it wonderful? Or here's another great example that I'm gradually leading you to understand: girl throwing a stone. If you don't understand the artist's train of thought, it might seem like some kind of mockery, and in a way, it actually is. Picasso detests the obvious, finding it dull and easily portrayed by anyone. And he creates another puzzle for us, or a headache. You've already figured out from those two tiny dots, almost invisible, that this elongated thing is a head with eyes. Another small dot turns a boulder into a belly with a navel. Two spheres are obviously breasts, and here he even omits the nipples. And even though they're not in the right places, we still recognize them. In fact, all these body parts look like some kind of stones, and Picasso is making fun of us. For contrast, he paints the boulder itself, the one that this stone maiden is throwing, in gray. And we all immediately see that it's not a part of the human body, even though there's also a dot on it. You see how important our perspective is to Picasso, how much he wants to show us a different side of reality, and once we learn to look, we begin to see, don't we? Let's move on to 1932. Having played with simplifying bodies, Picasso begins to simplify emotions. In all the previous paintings, we could make out a person, right? Can emotion be conveyed by simplifying or tricking the eye in the same way? This is a much more advanced challenge and a real test for Picasso's genius. Look, I won't mention the name of the painting on purpose. What is this woman doing, who seems to be drawn so primitively? We can immediately see that she is at peace. She is sitting in a comfortable position, her head tilted back in the chair. This whole painting radiates bliss, doesn't it? The painting is called The Dream, and we can clearly see that it's a very pleasant dream. We've seen dreams like this many times, and we really didn't want to wake up. So, is it possible to convey emotions using such a simple, almost primitive technique? And here is the next painting, and it looks very similar to the previous one. The same pose, the same blissful expression on the face, and closed eyes. This painting is called Reading. I specifically selected this series of paintings with similar subjects for you, so that you could trace the evolution of Picasso's perspective. Here he moves on to an almost graphic depiction, flat, without perspective, with muted colors, abandoning as many expressive means as possible. And yet we still see and feel the emotion of this woman. Picasso goes further and further, trying to find where the line is, when the human image will fall apart, break down into separate, disconnected elements, and stop evoking emotions in us. Here's another one, sitting before a mirror. Another step, and here, look, Picasso goes even further. But what if you remove even the human features and leave only the pose? And it seems to me that here Picasso already reaches such a degree of simplification that the emotion is barely recognizable. The woman's silhouette is barely distinguishable in the mirror's reflection, representing the utmost simplification while still allowing recognition of her pose. But even this is enough for us to grasp the story. So, did I manage to get you at least a little interested in Picasso's mysteries? I really hope so. Moving on to 1932, the painting Rest features the same subject but is now almost entirely detached from reality. Here we can barely recognize the woman by two circles and some lines for hair, but on our own, we would never guess that she's resting or what emotion she's feeling. Picasso distorted her head, moved her mouth between the two circles for eyes, put her nose on the side, and one breast has fallen off. Do you see any emotion in this painting? Would you recognize bliss if it weren't for the title? But even if not, it's endlessly fascinating to look at this painting. For me, this painting is nearly abstract and non-objective, on the verge of being recognizable. And I love Picasso precisely for the emotions, and this is also from the year 1932. The eyes are on the sides, the nose, the lips. Everything seems to have scattered in different directions, and here we already see almost complete abstraction. No emotions, pure experiment, pure desire of Picasso to claim for himself all possible forms of distortion of the human body. And all these completely different paintings created in different techniques he painted in just 1 year. All these styles and many more, in just a couple of years, Picasso, like a madman, almost mass-produces portraits in completely different styles, hurrying to become a pioneer, a trailblazer. And in the end, his boldness and his incredible work ethic move the giant called the art world, to the top of which he climbs. And absolutely deservedly so. This period of Picasso's work was the most brilliant and explosive, as if he was rushing to embrace the impossible and try everything in the world, both in love and in painting. In 1939, he had a new love. 58-year-old Picasso starts dating 31-year-old Dora Maar and paints her famous portrait. Most likely, 20 years earlier, such a portrait would have horrified or even offended any woman. Just remember the portrait of Gertrude Stein, where it all began. But now Picasso had already paved the way for himself with his extraordinary talent and fantastic work ethic, and now the world eagerly awaited his new experiments. All this would eventually lead him to his greatest achievement, the most powerful and my favorite painting, Guernica, created in May 1937 by commission of the government of the Spanish Republic. But I will make a separate video about this painting. Picasso, the most prolific artist in history according to the Guinness Book of Records, would go on to have numerous searches and discoveries, both minor and significant, eventually creating over 150,000 paintings. By the end of his life, Picasso would paint one painting a day, which, in my opinion, is more like mass production. And this, it seems, would greatly affect the quality of his paintings. And here I will express my personal opinion, but it seems to me that by the end of his life, Picasso would already be resting on his laurels. Every line that came from his pen would be worth thousands and millions of dollars, and his work would become flat, recognizable, and faceless. Picasso lived for 91 years, full of great discoveries, and I am not afraid to call it a creative feat. He died in 1973 undefeated, having tried everything and managed to do everything before anyone else. And I hope that after my video today, you too have found the keys to how you should look at Picasso. And why even a child couldn't have drawn this. Friends, please subscribe to my channel and like this video. Only this helps my channel grow. I launched a Patreon and Boosty. Please consider subscribing and sponsoring me. Thanks everyone.